Hello and welcome to Conversations with Clarity. I'm Jessica Knudsen, President and CEO at Clarity Child Guidance Center. Today we're going to be talking about the very complicated issue of foster care in the state of Texas, and we are very privileged to be joined by three CEOs of local agencies that are very involved in this process and are also fierce advocates for the children that are placed in the foster care system in our state. I'm very happy to be joined by Angela White, who is the CEO of CASA, Jenni, the CEO of Chosen, and Tara Roussett, the CEO of SJRC. And if you guys wouldn't mind, could we just start with you, Angie, a little background of your agency and how you play a role in this foster care system?
Okay, so I'm Angie White. Thank you. Nice to be here. Thank you for the invite. CASA deal with children that are already in the foster care system. So we train volunteers to advocate and walk alongside the children as they go through that process, particularly in the first court case. So the first year when they're only under temporary guardianship of the state. So we walk alongside them, we make sure they have their educational needs met, medical needs met, all of those things. But more importantly, we build a relationship with the children because they have been traumatized, they need a trusted adult by their side. And our request of all our volunteers is do not leave that child in that court case. Don't be another person that's left them. So in a nutshell, it's what we do. I have been in place there since February the 1st. I was a CASA advocate in Houston, so delighted to do this role today. Currently, we have 800 advocates. We have about 42 staff, but we need more. We're only serving around 70% of the children in the system.
So it sounds like one ask for the folks that are tuning in to this, if you have it in your heart to help out as a CASA volunteer, you're always looking for folks.
Yeah, and if they have it in the hearts to help children, what we'll do at CASA now, if it's not, the advocacy for CASA it's a long-term commitment, it's a lot. We will connect you with any other agency that serves children. So please know that, because if you've got a heart for serving children, we'll make it happen.
Wonderful, thank you.
Jenni? Thank you for having me. My name is Jenni. I'm the CEO of Chosen, and what we do is help caregivers and parents equip them, strengthen them to help their children heal from the trauma that they have experienced. We work with adoptive families, foster families, kinship providers, relatives who are caring for children that have been harmed by those that were supposed to care for them. And we also serve families who can be safely reunified. So we equip the caregivers to be an agent of healing in their home for their kids with parent coaching, mental and behavioral health services, and so forth. We've been in the community for about 13 years and working directly with friends like CASA and SJRC and Clarity to make sure that children are not only healing but have permanency so that they're not moving from home to home, because every time they move, that's another trauma, and we work to prevent that by equipping the caregivers that are caring for them as they go about their journey.
Great, thank you. Tara?
Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for having me here. At SJRC, we take care of kids all across the foster care system, to include prevention, to make sure that kids don't enter the foster care system. We have residential facilities, we have a child placing agency, we work with the community on licensing homes, which is a huge need, that we need more homes to open their heart. And then we've been doing that for about 40 years. And then the last year we have got into a new division of our organization called Belong. And with Belong, what we're doing is currently in stage 1 for all of the children in the South Central and Hill Country region, we are contracting with providers and working on safe placements to make sure that the kids in that entire region are in their least restrictive environment, working towards permanency and healing. And then we are slowly moving into stage 2 of the contract, which will make us be in charge of foster care and full case management for the entire region of the South Central and Hill Country, which is 27 counties. So we have about 1,000 kids across all of those programs in various stages of the foster care system. But again, the biggest focus for our organization and our community is really that prevention piece, so that kids do not enter the foster care system at all if we can help it.
Oh, big job.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for the work that your agencies do, and I think we have a good cross-section of the different facets of the foster care system with each of your representations. So thank you again for joining us today. You know, I think for folks in the community, there's not a lot known about foster care. I think, you know, if you ask just somebody on the street, they know that if a child's potentially being abused, the state can take custody and remove a child to place them in foster care. But I don't know if we have a lot of conversations about the impact on the child and the impact on the family. So, Angie, if we can start with you, what do you feel the impact of removal is on a child and family? And does that create some potential long-term issues for the child and the family?
Yes, it can do. I mean, if you consider, if you think about yourself as a child, 7 years old, and suddenly you come home from school one day and there's a strange car about to drive you to somewhere else with a person in it you've never seen, and worse, then they take your brother in another car and your sister in another car. I mean, in and of itself, even as functional, well, whole adults, that would be traumatic. So the trauma of removal, I think sometimes is not considered in relation to what is happening in the home that's causing the removal. So we need to think harder about that. I love Tara talking about prevention services. We've got to stop children coming in because that will stop the long term. But in the interim, we are tasked with serving the children within the system and not letting them down either. But I do think it causes more harm. We talk about the children without placement, which I know you've been involved with on several court cases together recently. Mm-hmm. And they want to go home. They run to go home. And I think, we look at our lives and how we raise our children, and we want that for all the children, but our way is not always the right way or the best way. And keeping connected with that family is essential, because when you don't, then you are bringing mental health issues. We see suicide rates go up. We see, children just suffering from anxiety. We see them moving schools 4 times, 5 times a year, and the exponential suffering and harm that can cause them. So removal in and of itself is a problem, and we need to stop the language of they're being saved when children are removed, because there's a flip side to every coin.
Absolutely. And Jenni, same question. What do you see as the impact of kids and families with that removal process?
Yeah, I would agree with Angie that, when a child is removed, that in and of itself is a traumatic event in that child's life. They were harmed in that home by some either neglect or abuse. There's a reason, a cause for them being removed. So they've already experienced some adverse childhood experience prior to removal. And then removal is another traumatic experience. If they're separated from siblings, if they're moved out of their school, all of those compound the trauma that child has experienced. And unfortunately, that manifests oftentimes in mental and behavioral health issues, I think, which is why we're here today. I was speaking yesterday with somebody, the cross-section between foster care awareness and mental health awareness, it's not just an intersection, it is an absolute collision. And, kids that have been in the foster care system are 80% more likely to need mental health assistance. That is 4 to 5 times a child who has not been in the foster care system. So removal is traumatic, but it's everything surrounding the cause for going into foster care, as well as what happens subsequently when that child is in the foster care system that contributes to those mental health needs.
Yeah, and I know it's something that we see at Clarity on a daily basis. Tara, Jenni mentioned adverse childhood events. If you work in this field, we refer to it as ACEs. Could you explain what that is and why it is so significant?
Sure. So the ACEs is a score that you can take an ACEs test and get a score. But really, what that score is showing you is what happened in your childhood that led to the trauma that you're currently experiencing or have experienced throughout your childhood. So as Angie and Jenni mentioned, just that, of course, the abuse that happened in the home for a child is an adverse childhood experience. But then when you remove the child, when they go into the foster care system and they're bounced from place to place to place, that continues to add to that. Then education, when you're moving your schools, there are so many confounded issues that our children are facing every single day that are causing them continued harm. And so the community and the people working in the field have to understand that and realize, it's not just opening your heart for a safe home. We need that, but you have to understand that the trauma that our kids bring with them, they're not always going to be grateful that you opened your heart in your home or that you're providing them a service, because what they want the most, I've been in this field a long time, and I've literally have never yet met a child that doesn't want to be home. Home is what they know, and it's really difficult for them to take that. And so every adverse childhood experience that they bring affects them. And also, it doesn't have to even, ACEs doesn't have to even relate to the foster care system. Children that come from a C-section birth, or anything like a divorce in the home. There is so many different things that compound together in the life of a human and what that can relate to in their trauma. And the kids in the child welfare system are just tenfold at risk.
And I'm going to butcher a quote, but the saying is it's easier to raise healthy children than repair broken men. Right. And I think that speaks to that, of having that awareness of those childhood trauma, because it does impact future development. And the research has shown that the higher your ACEs score is, can even contribute to how long you live and medical issues and your ability to hold down a job. I mean, it does have very real consequences for our society if we're not taking those into account down the road. So thank you. That's a really good point. We talked a lot about transitions, and Jenny, you mentioned kids getting pulled out of homes and getting maybe sent to other residential placements. How can the community at large or us as providers support kids during those transitions?
It's such a powerful and relative question. I think that we would agree, Jessica and I have had many conversations about this. Kids tend to blow up with the transitions. And as a system of care, we don't do a great job at preparing kids and youth for transitions, nor preparing wherever they're going for that transition. And so being really intentional about those transitions is super important. Transitions can be hard for any kids. I have 4, so I know this firsthand, and mine haven't experienced what the foster care population has. But attending well to them is super important. I'll give you an example. This week, I heard a grandma called me whose kids were removed from biological mom, and the kids were removed from when they were visiting. One was at a psychiatrist's office, and the other one was at a therapist's office. Well, that's a safe place for those kids to express their needs, to express their hurts. And when a caseworker arrives in this safe place to remove them from biological mom, that is extremely damaging and is going to cause distrust for future healthcare providers, because they're going to remember, and I've experienced this as a foster mom, they're going to remember what happened when they were at that trusted healthcare provider's office. That is a horrible plan for transition. So I think as a system of care, and this is not one agency's job, this is all of our responsibilities, is to think about being not just trauma informed, but trauma responsive. How can we best care for this child in this transition, whether they're exiting a psychiatric hospital and going to a step-down facility across the state? That child should be informed about the changes that are going to happen to them at an age-appropriate level. They should be able to express their emotions around that, as well as, let's just say that they're leaving the psychiatric hospital and they're going back home to a relative caregiver. We should be preparing grandma for what that child needs when they leave the psychiatric hospital. You don't go from that, what was traumatic, and obviously you have a wonderful facility, but having to go into that space, that is already a form of trauma for that child. They've been in a setting where there's a lot of structure. They know what to anticipate. People are meeting, very specific needs, and then they're going back into a home where there's less structure, and grandma may not be on the same page as the mental health provider where they're leaving. So we have to transition better on both sides for the youth and also where that youth is going.
Really good points. And it made me think, Angie, the work that your agency does, how does the voice of the child get pulled in to all of that?
And this is, and the new key phrase is like nothing about us without us, which is so important. And you're right about the age appropriate, but the littles need to know, as well as, the teens aging out. We've got to look at that aging out model as well, but they have to understand this. CASA, we will transport the children to a new placement. If they have a CASA, the white van doesn't come, and take the 4-year-old. And we had a case. Simeon is one of our advocates, picked up his 4-year-old little CASA, little man, and with his wife, they do it together, and then they went to get his little sister. And they would have gone in a white van. The baby would have had no formula. 4-year-old would not have been fed, because people are moving, right? It is a system. And these are children experiencing a system. They're not foster children. They're children experiencing a foster system. And we've got to make sure that they're treated like children. So Simeon picks his little 4-year-old up, little boy, little girl, 9 months old, in a car seat. They take them to the new placement, hour-and-a-half drive away. They get to the new placement, and again, the placements are moving fast. There's a boys section, a girls section. We all know that's normal. These children have never been separated. And an advocate was there to say, there's a crib in this room that you're putting the little man in. Can she not stay here? And they said, oh, yeah, sure. Without the question being asked, the system would have just gone. And he would have then been labelled naughty, because he would have been upset all night, because he looks after his little sister. And it's things like that, that the lens of how you would treat your own children is sometimes lost in the melee of a system. And they need to be cared for. Kathy Fletcher, who I adore, said something the other day about all a child needs is for one person to be crazy about them, to be okay. It's not a lot to ask, really. And I think we need to, and that's what CASA try and provide. We're not surrogate parents, children don't live with CASA advocates intentionally. We want them to go back home. We want them to go back to biological family in some way, shape or form. And we've got to do everything we can to do that for the children. But then nothing about us without us is so loud for me. It's their lives, and they deserve every opportunity to flourish and thrive, everyone. And we can make changes for that.
Very, very powerful example. Thank you for sharing that. And Tara, I think of your role in this as a residential provider. So you do provide placement. How does your world kind of fit into this? Because I think from what I'm hearing is the goal of this is permanency, is to either get kids back home or find a permanent foster care family or something that's going to give them that sense of home again. How does being a residential provider fit in that continuum?
Sure. So all of the things that Jenni and Angela have talked about are something that, again, when their kids come to us, they've experienced, and now with our new contract, we're the ones making those decisions on where they're going from place to place. And so that is where we have a span of influence to make things different and better for the child. Because again, you think about your own kids in your own home. I can't leave my house on an afternoon at 5 o'clock without telling mine where we're going and what time we're going to be back, and we're going to be there. But we think it's appropriate in the system to just rip kids out of homes and not give them that, just the explanation. So in our facilities, in our residential facilities, we look at it as short term. We do not, it's a safe place, and that's how I know that I can keep doing the work that we're doing. And as we don't want them there long term, but tonight they're going to be safe. They're going to have their needs met. We're going to do everything we can to prepare them for the next place that they're going to go to, and do that in a holistic, trauma responsive way. And so that's how that works in residential. But it takes everybody communicating. It takes really people in our community not being that armchair quarterback that thinks that they should have, could have, would have. We invite people to come in, be a part of the solution, get involved in some way, shape, or form to help these kids, because our kids deserve it. And the nothing about me without me is exactly what we say every single day in our facilities, is invite them in the conversation, give them voice. Our kids will tell you what they want. You just have to ask.
Yeah, they will.
And listen, and give it its credit. For
Yes.
Sure. You've all have touched on trauma, and the phrase trauma-informed care has been used a lot. Some of the folks tuning in might not be familiar with that concept. Jenni, what is that concept of trauma-informed care?
Right.
In a nutshell.
In a nutshell. It's unfortunately in our space, I think it's become a watered down term. Trauma is everywhere. It's on magazine covers, and I joke that my dog has trauma, when I go on vacation. And so I think being really clear about what it is important. Language is important, right? And trauma-informed care means that we are informed about how trauma impacts the child's brain or anyone's brain. Trauma actually rewires brain activity and how we respond to stimulus. And so understanding that as a care provider, as a mom, as a teacher, as an advocate, as a volunteer in a residential facility, we have to understand that the way that trauma impacts the brain, thinking, responses. And if we're not trauma informed, if we're not informed about that, we're not going to be providing appropriate care. In the example that I mentioned previously, somebody made a decision that was not very trauma informed in that, to think about what are the implications of us breaking the trust of this healthcare provider who is seen as a trusted adult in this child's life. Another example is when we remove kids when they're at school. Well, school is typically a very safe place for kids who have a chaotic home. So if you go and take a child out of their school and they're being removed by Child Protective Services, that is not trauma informed, because that child is going to be frightened of going back to school. That is the last thing we want, because that is a safe place for kids. So it really is the consideration of how has trauma impacted this child's thinking, and how am I going to adjust how I'm interacting with this child and youth.
So I think as well, when we talk about that, you talk about the trauma of the parents as well. You have to talk about the trauma of grandma getting a phone call in the middle of the night to say, can you take these 4 children tomorrow? And she's got to think, I've got 3 jobs to do tomorrow, or I won't be able to feed these children. We've got to think about how we interact with that family group as well, and anybody connected to it. Secondary trauma. Child Safe do a wonderful job with that for their employees. We're trying to bring that into for our advocates, But I think it's the way you speak to everybody and anybody around it, honestly. Because for a teacher to have a child pulled out of a class, it's not just the child experiencing that. It's the 30 other kids. Like, where are they going? Who is that stranger? It's the teacher then having to process that. And I think trauma it's like holistic. It's a little overused and, it's for all and everything now. But I do think that it's the mindfulness for me of how we talk to everybody in connection with it. Child's front and center. But, we have mothers mothering children that have never been mothered. That's not their fault. Okay. We have grandmas who thought, I'm retired, I don't have to deal with this. It's suddenly under the burden of care for their grandchildren who they love and adore, but they may just be above a poverty line. Don't judge them for not being able to take a child, or get the barriers out of the way and make them be able to have the child, but solve the problems. And I think that's prevention as well. How do we minimize barriers so families can care for their own children? How do we address the rates in legislature to say, if you're paying a foster care parent, and I'm making numbers up, if you're paying them $100, a week, whatever, we're not paying kinship families the same. Why not? We claim this is what we want, and our actions are not complete with that claim. So there's pieces, it's so big. So it's slightly outside the trauma lens, but it's everybody.
It's the example that comes to mind, which is so simple, is you mentioned the term CWAP. And if folks don't know what that is, it's children without placement. These are kids that we can't find a foster care placement for, a kinship placement, which is with another family member, or a residential facility. But just think about that. You're telling a kid, and the kids know what that means. They know what CWAP is. Just the impact of being told you are CWAP. I think that basic language that we're using is re-traumatizing the children in the system.
I can add a concept to that too, and that kind of all the pieces everybody's talking about is the piece of felt safety. So you can tell a child all day long that they're safe. I can tell you you're safe right now. But if you don't feel safe, none of that matters. And so we have to work with our kids to get them to a point of felt safety. So if you tell a child they're a child without placement, they're a CWAP child, that's not a very safe feeling.
No.
What does that mean?
Nope.
And so it's really thinking about that and taking that trauma responsiveness one step further to think about the person that you're talking to and how you're going to get them to feel safe. I can feed you 3 meals a day. That doesn't mean that you feel safe that your food's coming. You know, you might need to have a snack on you at all times so you feel safe. Something in your pocket, and it doesn't matter if dinner's served in an hour. You have to feel safe and full and not scared of your next meal. And so really taking that a step further and focusing on the child and their felt safety is critical.
Can I add on to that? I'm so glad that you said that. You know, our entire Child Protective Services is a system of last resorts. It is completely designed around a child's physical safety. That is the job of the foster care agency and the caseworker from the state to make sure a child is physically safe. Well, that having 4 children, that's not nearly enough to address the needs of the child. And Tara is exactly right. A child has to have psychological safety. And just because we as an adult can perceive that they are physically safe, that does not mean that that child feels safe, nor does it mean that we can actually see that they feel unsafe, because their little brains have been conditioned in chaos to live in a state of fight, flight, or freeze, where they have adrenaline and cortisol flooding through their body all the time, where they're on high alert. That's why a lot of these kids look like they have ADHD, and it may not be that at all, but because of what they've experienced living on high alert, they begin to act in ways that, as I would say, are unbecoming. They're ways that we don't want them to act. They're acting out because of what's happening on the inside of their body, and we shouldn't punish kids for that. That psychological felt safety is absolutely key in caring for this population and doing it well, and plays directly into the trauma-informed question that all of us should be considering the psychological safety of the kids that we're working with.
Well, one of the things we say at Clarity is kids do well when they can.
Right.
And we have to be mindful of that. And I think so often the kids in these situations get labeled as a bad kid, or they're acting out, where they're really just trying to survive and responding to the trauma that we have. And so we can't label them because they're responding to the chaos that you mentioned.
I'm going to steal that phrase. Thank you for that. That's going to be another one. I think kids do well when they can, and sometimes the simplicity is all we need to keep hold of, right? You know, and it is. Say, if you imagine yourself at 7, that event happened to you. Imagine yourself at 13, you know, being dropped off at Clarity, oh, your mum's coming, and then they don't. You know, and the food insecurity is huge, huge. So thank you for bringing that.
There's always meaning behind the behavior.
Always.
100%.
And we teach parents that, we teach caregivers that, because sometimes we tend to focus on just the behavior and trying to control behaviors. There's meaning behind it. A child develops strategies. Even if a child has lived in chaos and then they come into a home where everything is orderly, you're sitting down at the table together, and
very unsettling.
That is not comfortable for them. And they don't have the language or the cognitive ability to articulate how uncomfortable that is. So their strategy might be causing the chaos. Well, that is very enlightening to parents and caregivers who, you know, may just not understand the meaning behind the behavior.
We've talked a lot about the existing system that we have. I want to shift a little bit to what do you, as advocates and experts in this field, what do we need to do to shift this and to be more mindful of everything we've talked about and help these kids that are kind of caught in this bureaucracy at this point? Sure.
Yeah, so I think we'll all come at it from a different angle, and then I think as you hear from everybody, it'll be a unified picture. But I think from the provider perspective, the kids, the foster parents, the residential providers, the people in the community that are actually taking care of the youth once they've been removed, we have to come from an understanding of exactly what we've been talking about. The kids are going to act out, not because they're bad children, but because of the things that have happened to them. But yet those providers and those foster parents are held accountable in a punitive regulatory environment that causes fear. So we wonder why we have CWAP. Well, we need to have we as the providers need to have felt safety in taking care of the kids and knowing and understanding trauma, that things are going to happen because of what happened to the child. And as we work through the process and work towards their healing, we've got to have better understanding of that. So foster parents feel safe in opening their home without worried about them getting deficiencies on their license and personally held accountable for when things happen. I think that's a piece that as we talk about improving the system, we have to recognize that, because the people taking care of the kids nights and weekends need to feel safe as well. And it's not the kids' fault ever.
And I think an important piece of that is that, a lot of people might not know we've lost a tremendous amount of residential beds in the state of Texas.
Over 1,000 beds in our state.
Which does impact the ability for a kid to find a permanent place, and I think it's directly contributed to the CWAP issue that we have referenced a few times. Jenny, same question.
Yeah, so I'm very passionate about systemic transformation. That's why I got into this space. I have a brother who came into our home in 1995 through foster care, and I saw the inside of a system that is designed to protect children and how they can actually experience harm in that system. So this is a hot topic for me, and I think there has to be a fundamental shift from the child's physical safety, like what we talked about earlier, just child protective system, to shifting into a child and family well-being system. The system of care is not even measuring these children's well-being. And going back to ACEs, like, what are the long-term consequences and impacts of these traumas that the kids have experienced and the parents have experienced to society? How does that contribute to homelessness, substance abuse, mental health issues, early teen pregnancy? Like, it is impacting these other systems within our community. So if we're not focused on the child and family well-being, we're going to keep having the same problems that I saw in 1995 that I still see today, because our focus is on the child's physical safety. And frankly, it's just not enough. We have to address, a child is within a system themselves. A child belongs in a family. We all agree children belong in families. Mm-hmm. That's a system. You have to address the well-being of that family system. And so oftentimes, in order to get to prevention, we have to address the unhealed trauma of the parents themselves or the caregivers that these children are being raised with, that is contributing to that intergenerational trauma. If we're going to make a difference in that intergenerational trauma not perpetuating itself into more cycles of abuse, we have got to step in and have a shift of our thinking around child and family well-being. It can't just be child protective services.
And am I accurate that about 95% of the budget is on the child protective services and about 5% is on that prevention piece you just spoke to?
95% of it is on this. We're talking about the child welfare budget in the state of Texas is on foster care, where 5% is on prevention. So I'm so glad that you brought that up. We have to put our money where our mouth is. Absolutely. Everybody talks about getting upstream. Well, how are we going to get upstream if the dollars are all flowing down here at the foster care level? That is not there. There's an incongruence there that's just not tolerable, frankly.
I want to expound on that and then hear from Angie. We've been involved in a fairly complicated situation where, to Angie's earlier point, it's a child that really wants to go home.
She does.
And how could we support that system to make that happen? I think anything else we do is going to fail because her safe place is home. And, is that money better spent to put some supports in the home and help the parents rather than trying to force the solution that I don't think ultimately will be successful. And it's just re-traumatizing the kid.
Yeah.
So.
I think we've got to get to the front end of this issue, is where I think we've got to prevent and slow down children coming into the system. So you look at investigations, and I am not bad-mouthing CPS. Those people are there, minimize, so much gone on. They don't seem to be able to do right for wrong, so much. But I think we have to look at the way investigations are done, and when children are removed. We've got to get to the front end. There is some data I've seen recently that may suggest that around 30-ish% of children that are removed should not be. And for legal reasons, not because you feel it, not because you go in and the house is, perhaps upside down or things are happening, but for solid reasons. And I think we've got to look at that systemic change in CPS. Jamie Masters, the commissioner, will tell you herself, CPS should not be a parent to children. She'll tell you that. She's very open about it. And she's right. And have respect for her actually speaking that. They were set in place to prevent physical harm to children. And then the rest of us have to kind of wrap around and make sure that we can provide what the system does lack. Language change, the bureaucracy of how many people they have, like 30,000 people or something. You talk about change like that, it takes a long time. But I think we've got to look at kind of the feeding tube of this and how do we, as a community, ensure that the people that are investigated either get the services they need then and stay in family-based, do not have a SAPSA case, not have a suit against parent and child case together, but we are providing the right mental health services. Same case, was with you for longer, then she should have been responsible for her or the provider, because then you're stopping another child, right? The right mental health services in the right place at the right time at the right cost level. It's not just mental health, because marriage therapy versus children's therapy, totally different things, right? So how do we get that service in the right place at the right time? A lot of pushback about House Bill 567, which has slowed removals, but we've seen a child death increase. Maybe it's too early. I don't have many problems with the bill, other than the community's not ready, the wider community. And then if you stop spending, 30% of your budget because children aren't in foster care, do you re-put that into a true intake process? Do you then put that into the communities? So somebody who's living on the poverty level is not catching 3 buses to go and see a therapist and taking a day off work that they'll probably lose a job for. So it's the system of CPS, I agree, we've got to do something there. So much more. But I'm a foster and adopted child. Children can thrive and flourish and be all they choose to be. We cannot lose sight of, my ACEs score is an 8 out of 10. We cannot lose sight of these children are worth it. All the difficult things, the resilience, all the things, they can come through this and be outstanding human beings. Outstanding. La Catherine was in Tara's program. She had a CASA. She's 21. That girl, she's going to be like the next Oprah Winfrey. She is out there. She is phenomenal. She was on a panel for us talking about, y'all listen to me, all you kids in the system, you have choices. I will show you what they are, and I will walk with you through them. Nothing about us without us. Let's get those role models out there. Let's tell this community these kids are worth every minute of it.
Absolutely.
Yes, every minute.
I appreciate that, Angie. And we unfortunately have a few remaining moments. I know we could speak on this topic for probably several hours if they allowed us to. I appreciate your passion that you all bring to this. But just to wrap us up, and it's something that you touched on, Angie, is that concept of resiliency. If maybe you could all just speak to that concept and any last thoughts that you have on this topic. Tara?
Sure, and I'll just go off of what Angie said, is that every child is worth it. They can heal, they can thrive, and they will. We just have to believe in them, the community, and wrap around not only the child, but the entire family. We are really focused on the concept of family well-being, and it's going to take us being uncomfortable to get to the resiliency. You've got to be, as functioning adults, professionals, in the community, you have to be okay to walk in the uncomfortable and help these families, because it's going to, that resiliency that they can have and they do have is going to affect our future. I always say in the system, we're raising our neighbors. So it's going to take all of us to step in and do that and walk in the uncomfortable, be there for them. And I could not end without saying there is hope and there is healing. It just takes us all doing it together and moving in the same direction for the best interest of the children and families that we're serving.
Thank you for that, Tara. Jenni?
I love this question. I think there's a common misconception out there. I grew up, I have with a psychology and counseling background, hearing children are resilient. I heard it yesterday by an adult in the community. Children look like they're resilient because they tend to just go with whatever's happening.
Right.
The reality is that if there is trauma happening for a child, it has to be addressed at some point in that child's life. So it may look like they're resilient at 8 years old, but they become the 22-year-old that is grappling with what happened and coming to grips and terms with. And then there might be substance abuse issues and all of the things that can manifest from unhealed trauma. So resiliency comes from overcoming adversity, right? And that's a skill that can actually be taught. So one of the things that we teach our children, youth, and their parents is that sometimes they need we call it scaffolding. They need somebody to help show them the way. And the reality is we all have strengths within us that maybe haven't surfaced. So teaching a child and an adult that they have strengths within them, resources within them that they can draw upon because they've overcome hard things in the past, that takes a lot of deliberation. And so a blanket statement of children are resilient is not really helpful. I think as providers and the larger community, we have to understand that resiliency is a skill that can be taught. And I 100% agree with Angela. Our stories and the painful places of our stories are actually what help us to be relatable and to help others. And so overcoming those childhood experiences and those adversities is actually, that can be really powerful in a child's future. So there's absolutely hope to overcome it, but it really does take intentionality to build resiliency with this population.
Great point.
I have a real dislike of the term at the moment because people wear it like a badge of honor, or they want to pin it on you like a badge of honor. What's the choice? What's the choice? Something happens to you, either survive it or you don't.
Right.
And then you either get help later or you don't. So resiliency, so you survived bad things and that makes you resilient. I'm always kind of playing with that fine line of, and then people wear it like a medal. Now, I'm not saying that, I think you're right, it can be taught, but people need therapy. They don't have to hold it like, well, I'm resilient and therefore nobody needs to help me understand what's happened in order for me to be well and whole and healed. So I think, did you survive something? That's brilliant. Don't be a victim, be a survivor. But know that asking for help, whether that's therapeutic help, whether that's wrapping yourself with people who love you, it's not a sign of weakness. Absolutely. And you don't have to wear that badge like a coat of armor, but you survived something and that's beautiful in its own right. But then get the help and be taught and learn. And I have this book, am I allowed to do my Brené moment? So I'm not going to misquote her. This is about belonging, and I think we expect so much of children to be adaptable to their circumstance. We have, foster parents who do beautiful jobs, and we have grandmas, but the children need to feel like they belong. And it's super, they are okay as they are. I'm glad you mentioned strengths. We're going to do teenage strengths finders with some of our children, so they inherently know what their strengths are. But it says, true belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. And instead of children adapting always to, I have to be a good girl or a good boy and, do this, sit like I'm really good at the table or cause chaos, it's one extreme or the other. It's not about that. Everybody deserves to be and belong as who they truly are. And I think if we think about that hard enough, that could be a game changer.
Wow. Well, what a great quote to end this discussion on. And I personally thank you all again for making the time to have this discussion. I find my source of hope in knowing that there are advocates like the three of you out in the community fighting these fights every day for our kids. So thank you again for the work that you do.
And thank you to Clarity and you as well. You've done that. It takes a village, right? It takes all of us.
It does. It does. So hopefully audience will join us next time for another conversation with Clarity, but it has been my pleasure to host Angie White, Jenni Lord, and Tara Roussett for today's discussion. Thank you.